Imagine a country spending more on its military than the next several major powers combined. Now imagine that budget becoming so enormous that one portion of it can rival the entire economies of nations. Fighter jets worth more than $100 million each. Military bases scattered across the planet. Billions spent on artificial intelligence and experimental weapons. This is the United States military, the most expensive defense machine ever built. But the real mystery is not simply how large the number has become. It is what happens after Congress approves the money, where those hundreds of billions actually go, and whether spending more necessarily makes America safer. To understand the scale, consider the Pentagon budget planned for 2023. Depending on exactly which defense-related accounts are included, different calculations produce slightly different totals, but one broad estimate put annual national defense spending at roughly $853 billion. It was larger than the annual economic output of many entire countries. And unlike the image most people associate with military expenditure, that money was not simply being exchanged for tanks, bombs, aircraft, and warships. A modern global military is essentially an enormous ecosystem. It pays troops and civilian employees, maintains bases, operates hospitals, laboratories, builds infrastructure, develops experimental technology, and keeps existing weapons ready. Roughly $352 billion in this 2023 breakdown was associated with operations and maintenance, an intentionally broad category covering much of what keeps the Department of Defense functioning every day. Aircraft require maintenance even when they are not fighting. Ships require crews, repairs, fuel, ports, and spare parts. Soldiers need training facilities and security, transportation, administration, and communications. Health services alone represented tens of billions of dollars, including environmental cleanup at sites contaminated by chemicals or unexploded munitions. The weapons may attract attention, but keeping the institution alive is itself extraordinarily expensive. When you hear that the United States can spend hundreds of billions of dollars on defense in a single year, what do you believe consumes most of it? Weapons, military personnel, overseas bases, or the companies supplying the Pentagon? Because as we follow the money, the structure becomes much more surprising than the headline number suggests. More importantly, the budget eventually leads us to a deeper question about whether this system is driven only by national security or also by economic and political incentives that make reducing military spending extraordinarily difficult. One major expense comes from geography, only to defend its own borders. For decades, it has sustained forces, facilities, supply networks, naval deployments. Maintaining installations thousands of miles from American territory creates costs that a primarily domestic military would never face the same scale. Supplies have to cross oceans. Personnel and their families need housings, health care. An overseas installation can function almost like a small American town transplanted into another country. Washington is paying not only for territorial defense, but also for the capacity to project military power rapidly into Europe, East, the Indo-Pacific, and other strategic regions. Overseas airfields must be maintained. Equipment has to be pre-positioned before a crisis begins, without a major American ground war. In effect, the United States pays for military reach as well as military strength. That reach helps protect allies, support deterrence, secure strategic interests, and preserve Washington's influence within an international order. Then there are the people. In the same budget framework, roughly $172 billion was devoted to military personnel, covering areas such as pay and benefits for active duty forces and other personnel costs. The broader Defense Department workforce also includes reservists and a vast civilian workforce, making the institution one of the largest employers on Earth depending on how employment is counted. Every advanced fighter aircraft stands an enormous human organization. Pilots, mechanics, engineers, intelligence, and thousands of other roles. Recruiting and retaining specialized talent creates another challenge because the Pentagon increasingly competes with private technology companies for people skilled in fields such as artificial intelligence, advanced computing, engineering, and cybersecurity. $140 billion in the referenced budget was directed toward preparing for wars that may look completely different from those of the past. These programs remain classified, but publicly known work has included artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, equipment designed to improve what soldiers can carry or accomplish in combat. Autonomous underwater vehicles can operate in environments too dangerous or difficult for conventional crews. High-energy lasers are being airborne threats. Much of this research never becomes a successful operational weapon, but technological superiority requires accepting that many experiments will fail before a useful system emerges. Military research has also repeatedly escaped the battlefield and shaped civilian life. Technology development or advancement of systems that eventually became deeply embedded in modern society, including satellite navigation, advanced computing, and sensing. That creates another reason the defense budget is difficult to judge only by looking at weapons purchased in a particular year. Some spending is intended to solve immediate military problems, while some is effectively a massive long-term technological wager. The Pentagon is attempting to anticipate what warfare could look like 10, 20, or even 30 years into the future, because discovering too late that a rival has achieved a decisive technological advantage could carry consequences far greater than the original research cost. There is also military construction, a smaller category by Pentagon standards, but still measured in tens of billions of dollars. New hangars, command facilities, storage, training grounds, runways, housing, and overseas infrastructure allow the rest of the military machine to function. Projects worth tens of millions of dollars can appear almost minor when surrounded by $100 billion categories, yet each one represents another permanent piece of a worldwide system. But even after operations, personnel, research, and construction are accounted for, we still have not reached the part most people picture when they hear the words military budget, actually buying the weapons. That is where individual price tags become astonishing, where the story begins shifting from the Pentagon itself toward the private corporations that build much of America's military power. Procurement is where the abstract scale of the Pentagon budget suddenly becomes tangible. Instead of broad categories like maintenance or personnel, this is where taxpayers can see individual aircraft, missiles, helicopters, armored vehicles, ships, ammunition, and communications. Well over $100 billion across the defense budget, and even a small selection of equipment shows how quickly the numbers multiply. A sophisticated combat aircraft can cost more than $100 million before its lifetime operating expenses are counted. A single modern cruise missile can cost more than $1 million. Multiply those prices across dozens of aircraft, hundreds of missiles, thousands of vehicles, and an entire fleet, and what initially seems impossible begins to look almost routine. Consider combat aviation alone. The United States does not simply purchase an aircraft and place it on a runway. Every platform requires engines, spare parts, software, weapons, maintenance equipment, of logistical support. Programs such as the F-35, therefore, cannot be understood only through the price of an individual jet. The F-35 was designed as a family of advanced stealth fighters capable of serving different branches of the American military and allied nations, but its extraordinary complexity created delays, technical problems, expensive upgrades, and immense long-term costs. Estimates of the program have reached into the trillions of dollars. It demonstrates an important reality of modern warfare. The same multiplication occurs almost everywhere else. Black helicopters require billions in procurement and support of dollars each before their crews and lifetime operations are considered. Tactical vehicles costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, precision missiles may cost more than a typical American earns over many years, yet hundreds can be required because a major conflict could consume stockpiles at a frightening speed. This is why military budgeting operates on a scale that feels detached from normal economics. The Pentagon is not purchasing isolated machines. It is trying to maintain entire interconnected fleets and industrial capacity for a war it hopes will never happen. For years, Pentagon-wide financial audits have repeatedly failed to produce a clean opinion. That does not mean auditors discovered that hundreds of billions of dollars had simply vanished or been stolen. The problem is more complicated. Defense Department operates vast inventories, legacy accounting systems, properties, weapons, repeatedly identified weaknesses that prevent all of its financial statements and assets from being verified to the standard expected in a clean audit. Taxpayers, however, the fundamental concern remains powerful. An institution receiving such enormous public funding should be able to demonstrate clearly where its assets are and how its money is being managed. This becomes even more significant because the Pentagon does not build most of its sophisticated equipment by itself. Enormous amounts of defense spending ultimately flow outward through contracts with private companies. Lockheed Martin, RTX formerly known General Dynamics, and Boeing have repeatedly appeared among the most important American defense contractors. Sensors, and countless other components that the military cannot simply purchase from ordinary commercial suppliers. The deeper issue is what happens when the government becomes heavily dependent on a relatively small collection of corporations for capabilities that are essential to national security. The American defense industry was once spread across a much larger number of major firms, Mergers created companies with enormous technical expertise. If the Pentagon needs a highly specialized weapon produced by only one supplier, ordinary market pressure becomes weak. The government cannot simply walk into another store and purchase an equivalent stealth fighter, missile defense interceptor, nuclear submarine, or strategic bomber. Once alternative suppliers disappear, restarting them can itself in the strange position of being the world's most powerful military customer while still possessing surprisingly limited choices about whom it buys from. Limited competition becomes particularly concerning when prices rise far beyond expectations. It's that every expensive military component is automatically overpriced. A part designed for an aircraft operating under extreme conditions make it legitimately more costly than its civilian counterpart. Yet when a sole supplier controls a critical item, determining a fair price becomes harder. The Pentagon needs the equipment, the contractor knows that it needs it, and the normal competitive mechanism that disciplines prices may be missing. This is the point where military spending becomes more than a story about national defense. It becomes a story about incentives. Defense companies are for-profit corporations. Their responsibility is not simply to produce weapons, but also to secure contracts, generate returns. The Pentagon, meanwhile, needs reliable suppliers capable of producing extraordinarily complex systems when the country genuinely requires a new capability. But they are not identical. A military may eventually decide that a certain program is unnecessary, while the company manufacturing it has every economic reason to keep production alive. That tension would already be complicated on its own, but defense contractors operate within a political system where military budgets are determined by elected lawmakers. Lobbying itself is a legal and common feature of American politics, and corporations across almost every industry do it. Defense is different. The product is tied directly to national security. It gives contractors an enormous incentive to influence the environment in which those decisions are made. It also means discussions about weapons are rarely purely technical. Strategy, employment, local economics, corporate interests, military requirements, and electoral politics, senior military officers and defense officials possess extremely valuable knowledge about weapons programs. Some take positions with defense companies as executives, advisors, consultants, or board members. Movement can also occur in the opposite direction, with individuals who have worked in the private sector later taking influential government positions. Experience itself is not evidence of corruption, and people with decades of defense expertise naturally possess skills valuable to both sectors. The concern is structural. The appearance or possibility of conflicts of interest becomes difficult to ignore. Yet lobbying and the revolving door are only part of the mechanism. The most powerful political protection for military spending may be something far more ordinary: jobs. Defense districts throughout the United States. A fighter aircraft may be assembled in one location while its engine, electronics, landing gear, thousands of smaller parts are produced elsewhere. A shipyard may dominate employment in an entire community. When a weapons program supports workers across dozens of political districts, canceling it stops being merely a military decision. It can threaten factories, suppliers, local tax revenue, and lawmaker can therefore support increased defense spending without needing any secret arrangement with a corporation. And this is where the system becomes remarkably difficult to unwind. The Pentagon funds contractors. Contractors create jobs across congressional districts. Those jobs give lawmakers a reason to protect military programs. Contractors have additional incentives to support political relationships with policymakers who influence defense budgets. Congress then authorizes and funds the Pentagon, sending money back through the same network. Each participant can defend their decision individually, yet together they create a powerful cycle in which reducing spending becomes politically painful even when the strategic necessity of a particular program is disputed. Is the deeper machinery behind America's enormous defense budget. But it still leaves the most important question unanswered. If military power can deter wars and protect allies, at what point does more spending stop creating security and start creating a new kind of danger? The political power of defense spending becomes easiest to understand when a weapons program is connected to a local economy. Imagine a senator or representative whose state contains a major shipyard, aircraft factory, missile plant, or network of military suppliers. Supposed to ask whether a particular program genuinely improves American security and whether taxpayers are receiving sufficient value. From a local perspective, however, the same program may provide thousands of well-paid jobs. Canceling it could mean layoffs, declining business for suppliers, and angry voters. The contractor does not need to control the politician directly. The economic geography of defense production can create its own political pressure, turning a military contract into something that communities and their representatives are strongly motivated to preserve. Mississippi provides a useful illustration long been home to major shipbuilding activity, and Roger has been a prominent advocate for increased naval capacity and defense spending. Supporting more shipbuilding can be presented as a national security argument, particularly when American strategists are increasingly focused on same time. Expanding naval construction supports jobs and industrial activity connected to Mississippi. Defense contractors and their employees who support continued procurement, while lawmakers benefit politically when federal spending creates employment in their states. The important point is that they can reinforce one another until increasing expenditure becomes easier politically than reducing it. Cutting an aircraft order may affect not only the final assembly plant but engine manufacturers, electronics companies, software developers, metal suppliers, maintenance contractors, and smaller businesses scattered throughout the country. Members of suddenly share an incentive to protect the same defense program because jobs in both of their districts depend upon it. Military expenditure therefore becomes simultaneously a security policy, industrial policy, employment program, and political asset. Once those functions become intertwined, weapon is no longer a purely military question. Still, explaining the enormous American defense budget only through corporations' lobbying would produce an incomplete documentary. There is another reality that cannot simply be dismissed. Military power can prevent wars as well as fight them. Deterrence depends on convincing a potential enemy that aggression will cost more than it can possibly gain. American alliances in Europe and Asia partly rely on this principle. Aircraft carriers, nuclear forces, submarines, long-range bombers, missile defenses. Their existence is also intended to persuade adversaries that attacking the United States or its allies would trigger consequences severe to accept. A weapon that never fires may, under this logic, have succeeded precisely because no one dared force it to fire. But deterrence contains a dangerous paradox. When one country increases its military strength to feel safer, its rival may interpret exactly the same action as preparation for aggression. The rival then increases its own forces, causing the first country to feel threatened again. Neither side necessarily wants war, yet both can become trapped in an escalating competition. The Cold War demonstrated this on an almost unimaginable scale. The United States and Soviet Union accumulated nuclear arsenals capable of devastating civilization many times over. A similar security dilemma remains relevant in an era of growing competition among the United States, China, Russia, and other powers. Military competition increasingly extends into cyber operations, satellites, artificial intelligence. The Pentagon can reasonably argue that ignoring these developments would create dangerous vulnerabilities. A disturbing possibility is that every country can behave rationally from its own perspective while collectively creating a world that is more heavily armed, more expensive to stabilize, and potentially less forgiving of a single mistake. This brings the debate to an alternative instrument of power that rarely receives military-scale funding: diplomacy. Diplomacy is slow. Negotiations can last years, may directly conflict. There is no dramatic aircraft rollout and no visible missile launch demonstrating immediate strength. Institutions, arms control agreements, and sustained negotiation have repeatedly helped governments manage disputes. Effective diplomacy can depend on credible military leverage, while military deterrence can become dangerously unstable. The balance between them reflects the full range of threats. Strategic capabilities. Counterterrorism measures. There is also an unavoidable economic reality behind every defense budget: opportunity cost. Federal budgeting is more complicated than simply moving money directly from a fighter jet into a school or hospital, but resources are ultimately finite. Hundreds of billions committed to defense cannot also finance infrastructure, scientific research, or other public priorities. And those investments can also influence national security. A country with fragile infrastructure, vulnerable digital systems, or inadequate disaster preparedness can possess extraordinary military power while remaining exposed. That is why the original question turns out to be much harder than asking whether $853 billion is too much. The United States spends enormous sums because it maintains an enormous institution with global responsibilities, expensive personnel for conflicts it desperately hopes to deter. But the same system contains incentives that can push spending upward independently of strategic necessity. Contractors seek revenue. Communities depend on defense jobs. Lawmakers want employment in their districts. Military branches protect, creating genuine reasons for Washington to respond. Every pressure has its own logic, and almost all of them point in the same direction: more spending. The most revealing fact about American military spending, then, may not be the price of a missile or fighter jet. It is how difficult the machine becomes to slow once security, industry, employment, politics, and technology are connected. The real measure of a defense budget should not simply be whether the country can afford another weapon, but whether that investment produces more security than the alternatives. Sometimes the answer may genuinely be yes. Sometimes deterrence requires overwhelming capability. But a powerful nation also has to recognize when fear are influencing decisions that should be based on strategic necessity. Otherwise, spending intended to create safety can become an automatic cycle in which every new threat produces another weapon, and every new weapon helps justify the next. National security is larger than the Pentagon. It includes military strength, but also functioning institutions, resilient infrastructure, economic stability, technological leadership before soldiers are required to solve them. The men and women who serve in the American military can deserve respect, while the system financing that military still deserves relentless scrutiny. Those ideas are not contradictory. In fact, responsible scrutiny is essential, and the consequences include both national survival and global stability. The question America must continue asking is not simply how much military power it can purchase, but how much security that power actually buys. And if you enjoy documentaries that go beyond the headline and uncover the systems, incentives, and hidden forces shaping the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many stories where the numbers we see on the surface hide something much larger underneath, and those are exactly the stories we will continue investigating.